I'd like to begin the sermon today by reading a coworker letter. It's dated February 25th, 1985. It was written by Mr. Armstrong, so it was essentially, I guess, the last year of his life, as we now look back, and we know that. So he writes, Dear brethren and co-workers with Christ. And again, this is February 25th, 1985. And he says here, he writes, a drastic world-shaking turn of events may occur unexpectedly this year. This is the 40th year, and historically, the 40th year has been the year of drastic turn in national and world events. And I would just interject, if I could, maybe even church events. He continues, it was after 40 years that Moses left Egypt as prince and fled to Midian. It was at the end of another 40 years when God called Moses at the incident of the burning bush to lead the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery in the great migration to the promised land. It was at the end of that 40 years that Moses died and Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River into that promised land. These were actually turning points in national events of world significance in history. It was at the foot of Mount Sinai that the nation of Israel was born, at the great ceremony after God had in a voice of thunder spoken the words of the Ten Commandments in the hearing of the more than 2 million people that comprised the nation of Israel. It was at the end of 40 days of fasting atop Mount Sinai that Moses received the 2 tablets of stone on which God, with his own finger, had engraved the words of the Ten Commandments. It was at the end of 40 days of total fasting that Jesus qualified to wrest the government of the whole earth from Satan after the great temptation recorded in Matthew chapter 4. And now, in 1985, we are at the end of 40 years since the founding of the United Nations, and 40 years since the dividing of the continent of Europe right down the middle as a result of the Yalta Conference. And he goes on to describe some of that and talk about those things. And I'm going to drop down here a little bit in the letter. He continues on. For more than 40 years now, the Plain Truth has been proclaiming an outstanding series of Bible prophecies of something due soon to occur in Europe that will change the whole world and shake up the lives of every one of us. Daniel's prophecy in chapter 2 pictures 10 nations in Europe in our time right now as the 10 toes and the 2 feet of the great symbolic image. 5 of those toes picture 5 nations in Western Europe and 5 in Eastern Europe. Then is pictured a great stone representing Christ at his soon second coming, smiting those toes and coming to rule in the kingdom of God over all those and all the nations of the earth. And now we can recall, as we now look back, so he said that in 1985. We're still waiting for these 10 toes to emerge. Now, in 1993, we did have the European Union that formed, as you recall. That was back in 1993, so 8 years after Mr. Armstrong wrote this. And then he says, for some reason, notice this, in 1985 he wrote this, for some reason, God has been holding back the fulfillment of this prophecy. Really? God has been holding back the fulfillment of this prophecy, but it is certain to occur. He doesn't waver as to whether it would occur or not. No, it's going to occur, but the statement is that for some reason, God is holding up the fulfillment of the prophecy. Could this 40th year be the year that will bring it about? And as we look back now, we realize, well, no, it did not. It did not come about in 1985. As a matter of fact, here we are in 2025, still waiting for it to come about. And so I think we'd have to say the statement is still true that for some reason God has been holding back the fulfillment of the prophecy. Still a true statement. Hasn't yet occurred. Now, we've seen steps. Like I said, we've seen the European come together, the European Union. So that is something that has happened. We know that, you know, that is part, I would believe, I think most all of us would believe, part of the moving forward of the fulfilling of the prophecy. But I thought it was an interesting letter. He touches on the significance of 40. I wanted to use that as an introduction to the sermon. Turn with me, if you would, brethren, to Numbers chapter 14. Let's go to Numbers chapter 14. And breaking in, I suppose you could say, to the thought of it all. As you recall, when we read Numbers 14, they are spying out the promised land, what was to be the promised land, and they come back with various reports, only two of which were good. And notice, if you would, in Numbers chapter 14, I want to read starting in verse 20. Numbers 14, starting in verse 20. So, God is not, should we say, overtly pleased with the response of the spies. And then as they give their report, of course, the people, reply in a negative down tone. God gets, I think, a little heated over it. Moses sort of intervenes. But then notice what God says here, starting verse 20. Then the Lord said, I have parted according to your word. Moses really cried out on behalf of the people. And God said, I have parted according to your word. I'm going to relent. But truly as I live, and, the fact that he's eternal, I think would denote he lives a pretty long time. He says, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt. So all these men who have seen my glory, it wasn't hearsay, it wasn't stories passed down from generation to generation. No, they witnessed it, they saw it, they were a part of it. They have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness. Because remember, at this point in the story, they had been traveling for a couple of years, and they've seen numerous signs, even going forth out of Egypt, of course, the Red Sea, and even after and beyond that. They were there. They saw these things. But notice, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. Verse 23, they certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. They're not going to be there. They're not going to cross over. They're not going to experience it. They're not going to be a part of it. I'm going to give them what they want. Because if you read earlier, chapter 14, it's all woe is me, and oh God, how could you, and oh, just leave us to die. Well, God said, all right, if that's what you want, I'm going to give you your way now. Because you have tested me these 10 times. And so, brethren, what is meant by these 10 times? The title of this sermon, by the way, is taken from that very phrase, what is meant by these 10 times? What is meant by these 10 times? Was it really 10? Was it a literal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, a literal 10 times, or is God just being dramatic? For those of you with children, sometimes maybe they're not quite listening right, and you say, I've told you 1,000 times to clean your room. Well, was it really 1,000 times, or are you just being dramatic? It probably wasn't really 1,000 times, but you're driving the point home. Or is that what God's doing here? Was it he just communicating like, listen, it's umpteen times now, and I've had enough? Or was it literally 10 times? What is meant by these 10 times? As God is pointing out his perseverance with his people through their rebellion, through their testing him. You've tested me these 10 times. Had God been tested an actual 10 times by this misbelieving people, the misbehaviors of these people? Well, if yes, then it becomes imperative for us to try and understand what it means to test God. I mean, if God is referring back to, you've tested me these 10 times. Well, if there really was this testing of 10 times, what does God mean that? Well, you've tested me, and because you've done this, now this is what's going to happen. We have to understand what is meant by a test. And the Bible does help us, brethren. The Bible does give us clues. It doesn't leave us in the dark. We just have to read the scriptures. Notice a little bit earlier in the chapter, still in Numbers chapter 14. And notice, if you would, a little bit earlier, verse 11, Numbers chapter 14, verse 11. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me or despise me? Like, how long? When's enough? When are they going to see what they need to see? When are they going to stop doing this? How long will these people reject me? How long will they despise me? How long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them down with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you, he's talking to Moses, a nation greater and mightier than they. And again, Moses did intercede on their behalf. But this is God's response to the people, which precipitated what we read in verses 20 through 23, where God says, these 10 times. This precipitated it. This is what built up to it, because God did perform mighty signs. Yes, in Egypt, we read about the plagues, and certainly a part of that whole thing was for Egypt to learn some lessons, even beyond Israel. We certainly can look at the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, just incredible miracles for Israel, all intending to guide them, to direct them, and to teach them to believe and to trust God. I suppose in some regards that those can be synonymous words, the trust and the belief. But God wasn't asking for blind faith. He was showing them through miracles and showing them through signs that God was for them. And of course, if God is for you, who can be against you? Yet, we read the stories, and we've all read them to one degree or another. And as a matter of fact, sometimes we all kind of shake our heads, how could they do that? How in the world can you see that and do that? Because we read the stories how Israel would, come into a certain situation. They would be faced with a particular circumstance, and God would perform a sign. God would help them through a miracle, and He would deliver. And then they would go from that event, and they would carry on. They would go to the next event, and then what would happen? Oh, they were. Oh God, you're God. We really believe you now. No, they did the absolute opposite every time. Constantly a response of disbelief, despite the evidence, right before their very eyes. Despite the evidence, they didn't trust, they didn't believe, and time and again we find that they are testing the Lord, rejecting Him, despising Him, despite it all. And so, again, the scriptures do take us along. They take us through the journey, and they teach us, well, what do you mean testing God? It means rejecting God, not believing God, not trusting God, despising God. Notice Exodus 17. Exodus chapter 17. And let's read here. verse 6, he says, behold, I will stand, here's one of these instances, behold, I will stand here before you, there on the rock, and it doesn't say a rock, it says the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And so he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Again, yet another clue which defines testing as Israel raises the question, is God with us or not? Is the Lord with us or not? Testing God, showing disbelief, showing a lack of trust, rejection, despising, despite everything that God did for them. You know, when they encountered difficulty, their response did not evidence a belief that God would move on their behalf. Even though they were developing a history, if you will, evidences, if you will, that God would move on their behalf. He did do it, but yet then they come to the next instance, and then they say, "Oh, you're not going to do it." But he did all the previous times before. And time and again, they evidence a disbelief that God would meet them in the place of their need, and you know, in their minds, instead of what should have been belief and trust, as it was being established through constant and continued deliverance, in their minds, God was absent. Just absent. Despite a pillar of fire by night and cloud by day. You know, it reminds me a lot of some of the splinter groups of today. You know, I remember back in 1995 when UCG formed. Back in 1995, it was May of 1995. You know, their whole basis was essentially, you know, we can't have one man rule. We can't have that. Well, from a human perspective, I can get it. You know, okay, so we had one man rule. That man went rogue, and the whole, you know, everything fell apart. And so then now the response is, well, we're not going to have a man rule again. We're going to do it our way. We're going to set up this pseudo democracy, and you know, we'll have our democratic voting process on the ministerial level, and we'll go that route. And all that told me back then is that, oh, okay, you don't trust that Jesus Christ is the head of the church. You don't trust him. In your mind, he's absent. You know, we may not have every single event recorded. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of recorded events in the scriptures. Maybe we don't have every event recorded for Israel and during this time period, but we definitely have snapshots of various events that occurred through that nation's journey. We definitely have that. The signs of the plagues against the Egyptians. Yeah, it was intended to judge Egypt, and essentially God showed, you know, every one of those plagues was, you could say, in opposition to one of the Egyptian gods, little g, and God showed who was God. And they were judged, but it was also meant to instill belief in his nation, in his people, the nation of Israel. And they watched. And I want to reiterate, brother, we're not talking hearsay. We're not talking, you know, stories that, well, it happened 100 years ago, and great grandma Betty, you know, told, you know, Elma, who told Louise, who told my mom, who told me. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about situations and instances that they literally witnessed. They saw and they watched with their own eyes the powerful work of God, especially in those 10 plagues. And then God delivered them from the hand of the Egyptians. I mean, they were slaves, and God delivered them and did something on their behalf that apparently they themselves couldn't do. God took them out of that land. And how does Israel respond? That's, I suppose, it's kind of I think most of us, if we're Bible students at all, we know exactly how they responded. So it's sort of a rhetorical question in one sense, but no, it's a question. How did they respond every time they come into a difficult situation? I suppose we could ask ourselves, how do I respond every time I come into a difficult situation? Did they evidence belief and trust? Or do they evidence testing God, despising God, rejecting God, not trusting God? Which one? Because as we search Israel's response, as we look at it to these various difficulties encountered during their journey, all along the journey, and we can go through the scriptures, and I'm not going to go through them all today. I'll leave that to you in your personal studies to go back through that journey. And, as Passover will come about here in the spring, it might be, again, a good thing to do to obviously go back and study and revitalize our minds and our thinking on those things. We're all along that journey. Every time a difficult situation would come up. Not an impossible one, but a difficult one. It's interesting to note that, yes, indeed, there are 10 times where they grumble and complain rather than believe God. There actually are 10 times that we can specifically see that are recorded, that we can read, where they complained, where they tested God, showing a rejection of God, showing that they despised God through their unbelief, through their lack of trust, and the God who was giving them everything, helping them in every way possible, performing tremendous signs and miracles. I want to read here a list of these 10 times. I'm not going to turn to all these verses. I'll reference them. And for you, those of you that are note takers, you can certainly write them down and you can study this if you so choose. But number one is Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 12. When they're at the Red Sea and where it seemed that Pharaoh's army would destroy them. And, oh, were there no graves in Egypt? You brought us out here to die. That's what we read. They tested God. They showed an unbelief in God. Now, again, physically speaking, you're standing and you got an ocean out in front of you. You got the mountains on this side of you, and you got Pharaoh plummeting down on you with his whole army and chariots on this side of you. Nowhere to go. But even at that point, God had showed quite a few miracles. Even up to that point, they seen it with their own eyes. So number one is at the Red Sea, where it seemed that Pharaoh's army would destroy them. Number two is Exodus chapter 15, verses 20 through 24, at Marah, where they found bitter water. It was 3 days into the journey, and they complained against God and despised and tested God through their unbelief. Exodus 15, verses 22 through 24. Number three, we find in Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. Exodus 16, verses 1 through 3. In the desert of Sin, as they hungered and complained and said, oh, if you would just let us die in Egypt. They were an optimistic bunch. Number four, Exodus chapter 16, verses 19 through 20. In the desert of Sin, as they paid no attention to Moses concerning the storing of the manna until morning. As you recall, they were supposed to do double on the preparation day, and they were not to go out on the seventh day. And they didn't even listen then, testing God. And number 5, Exodus 16, verses 27 through 30. Exodus chapter 16, verses 27 through 30. In the desert of Sin, as they disregarded Moses concerning the gathering of the manna on the seventh day. Again, refusing to obey. And as you notice, Numbers 3, 4, and 5 are all in Exodus 16, all having to do with the Sabbath day. Number 6, Exodus 17, verses 1 through 4. Exodus 17, verses 1 through 4. At Rephidim, as they complained for water, they contended and they tempted God over the water. Number 7, Exodus chapter 32, basically the whole chapter. just read the whole chapter. At Mount Sinai, Moses was delayed, doing something kind of important, something small, a little thing like getting the 10 Commandments from God. And what do they do? And what do they convince Aaron to do? Well, they build the golden calf. This is our God now. Just despising and rejecting everything God had done for them. So number 7, just all basically the whole chapter of Exodus 32. Number 8 is Numbers 11, verses 1 through 3. Numbers 11, verses 1 through 3. At Taberah, where the people raged against the Lord. Raged against the Lord. And God's fire was kindled, and even some of the people in the outskirts of the camp were burned up. They raged against God, rejecting, testing. Number 9, Numbers 11, verses 4 through 34. Numbers 11, verses 4 through 34 at Kibroth Hattaavah, in the grumbling provoked by the rabble for quail. And in that case, even because remember there was a mixed multitude with them, and they kind of led the charge, but the Israelites got behind them, and they gave in to intense cravings, as the Bible tells us. And for some reason, it seems to be the history would show the proclivity of Israelites is to gravitate towards the least common denominator of society. And then number 10, Numbers 14, verses 1 through 3, where we started. Numbers 14, verses 1 through 3, at Kadesh, in the desert of Paran, when the people refused to receive the good report of Joshua and Caleb, but rather wished themselves dead, and they got their wish. They got what they wanted. They got what they asked for. These 10 times, we can literally reference 10 times where God says, you have tested me, you have rejected, you have despised me through your abject lack of trust and your disbelief, despite all that you've seen and all that I've done. And so finally, God cries out, as we already read in Numbers 14. Remember in verse 11, God finally cries out. God does. He says, how long? How long? These people going to refuse me, reject me, despise me, and test me. How long? Because God indeed demonstrated his faithfulness, not just one time, not just not just some obscure little event that you could maybe miss if you weren't looking real close. No, God demonstrated time and again his faithfulness in each and every situation. But as soon as Israel encountered another one, they go from this one up, then they get into another difficult situation. They showed disbelief and unbelief through their grumbling, through their complaining, through their whining, all because of their disobedience. And their complaining cried out loudly, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Just an abject in God's face. Are you with us or not? Despite everything they had seen and everything they had experienced. I know I'm being repetitive here, but I really want to drive the point home. And I know it's very easy for us, and I've heard it many times over the years, how as brethren we talk about those Israelites and how ridiculous we think they are, and how could somebody do that? But yet here we are, supposedly with the Holy Spirit of God in us, by the way, because they didn't have that. They grumbled, they complained. Is the Lord among us or not? And then God concludes what? Well, God concludes what we read in where I started, Numbers 14, 21 through 23. Truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord, because these men have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and the wilderness, and put me to the test now 10 times. They have not heeded my voice. There they shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. They will not be there. They won't be there. And then when we continue down, verse 28, so say to them, as I live, says the Lord. And that's kind of a long-standing promise because he's eternal. As I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken. All right? Oh, this is what you want? Oh, okay. All right. I mean, hey, I'm here to give. So, this is what you said. Oh, and by the way, I heard you. So, in my hearing, so I will do to you. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above. Wow. 20 and above. You're not going to make it into the promised land. You're not going there. You're going to die in the wilderness, and your carcass is going to be out in the desert somewhere. Why? Because this is what you asked for. Now he says, except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun, you shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years. There's this 40. And bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear the guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. So they ended up having to journey for another 37 and a half, almost 38 years, for a total of 40 years. And then when we go to Joshua 5, as you remember, they cross over around Passover. So from the Passover in Egypt to the Passover they actually entered the promised land was 40 years. 40 years. And that testing of those 10 times, we know it was starting at the Passover in Egypt, where you see the signs and the wonders, and then you see those times, those 10 times they tested God through their despising and their rejection of God, despite all that he did and showed on their behalf. So we see this number again, this 40 years. This 40 years. I want to read a few excerpts from this article, and I'm not suggesting articles for doctrine by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought there were some interesting statements in this particular article. It's entitled, "Why and How Does God Use the Number 40 in the Bible?" Why and how does God use the number 40 in the Bible? It was written back in July 31st of 2021. And I'm just going to read some excerpts here. I thought it was interesting as we consider the subject here today. It writes here, people often associate the idea of a spiritual wilderness only with harsh, debilitating times of trial, but instead we should view our entire journey through this life as a journey through the wilderness. Sometimes it's a lush pasture, other times it's barren desert, but always a place where God is guiding us with a purpose. And we know that. We should all know that. There is an incredible human potential. And all that God does with purpose. As I think back, midnight to I guess 1986, for instance, going to 87, and what happened and the things that transpired in the early 90s. I mean, we're all perplexed. What is going on here? But at the end of the day, I know that God allowed it, and he allowed it for a reason. There was purpose for it. Continues on here. The only way to reach the promised land lies through the wilderness. That's interesting. Interesting how he's putting it here. It's where God calls his people to begin their journey. Everyone to one degree or another was out in the world. Now, I suppose we could say that maybe the second generation, it's a little bit different. Certainly for the parents who were in the world at one time, when you were called out of the world, call out of that wilderness, call out of your journey of life. It's where God causes people to begin their journey out of this present carnal world, represented by Egypt, to a place of preparation for the world to come. It's also where he reveals more of himself and his ways and teaches us how to fully rely on him to provide. And it's a big part of what this is, learning to trust God, rely on God, look to God. Through thick and thin, through good times and bad times. We must remember that the experiences we have on the way are critical to our spiritual growth. Absolutely. And that's what life is all about, is to be growing. Key to reaching the destination itself. If we don't grow in the character of God, if we don't put on the mind of Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter, because if we get to the end, it won't matter because we didn't grow, and we're not gonna be there anyway. Even the Hebrew word for wilderness, midbar, implies momentum, driving forward in a journey with purpose. We're not here twiddling our thumbs, kicking in the dirt, spinning our wheels. That's not what this life is about. That's not what this journey is about. God is turning the pages, and we got to keep up, and we got to move forward, and we have to progress, and we have to grow and be nurtured. As you remember, Mr. Armstrong said, as a begotten Christian. We're like the baby in the mother's womb. Well, that has to be nourished and strengthened and has to grow to be ready to someday be born. This article here references the Hebrew word midbar for journey. I just looked it up here, Bible Hub 4057, midbar, derived from the root dabar, meaning to speak or to lead. It corresponds to the Greek G 2048, often translated as desert or wilderness in the New Testament, used in contexts such as Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And then it gives a little excerpt here. It says, usage. The term midbar, let me just read down. The midbar is not just a physical location, but also a place of spiritual significance where individuals encounter God and undergo transformation. That's an important word, transformation, because where do we read about transformation? Well, we can go to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, can't we? Where it says, I beseech you, therefore, brother, by the mercies of God, don't be present yourselves a living sacrifice, not a dead sacrifice, a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable God, which is your not unreasonable service, just reasonable, based on everything God does for us, based on everything God shows us, based on all of God's keeping of his promises and helping us all along the way. He says, listen, it's reasonable. It's your reasonable service. And what is our reasonable service? Don't be conformed to the world. Don't take on the outward appearance. Don't take on the outward attitude. Don't go in the direction of the world. Why not? Because Apostle John says it's passing away, the whole thing. Don't go that way. Don't try and look like them. Don't try and mimic them. Don't try and act like them. Don't be conformed. But what does it say there in Romans? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So in other words, not even just our actions, but our very thinking, our very thoughts, because what we think and our thoughts and our thinking and it's what we eventually will do. But that takes place on the inside. That's a transformation on the inside, and that's the whole story of the butterfly and the cocoon, and that whole example that we can draw from. Be transformed, that you may, prove what is that good and perfect will of God. Midbar. Again, I just thought it was interesting how this article points to that. It says here, God is accomplishing something in us as we journey through the wilderness. Do we believe that? Do we really? And we have to surrender to him fully. And I circled fully. Why did I circle fully? Because fully is different than 95% or 90% or even 99%. Fully. We have to surrender him fully. It's 100% and trust that he is leading us in the right direction. Because let's face it, right, brethren? We don't always know. We don't see as God sees. We don't know what God knows. Our thoughts are not his thoughts. Our ways are not his ways. And our righteousness, no matter how good we think we are, is filthy rags in the nostrils of God. We have to trust that he's leading us in the right direction. Blind trust? Blind faith? Or does God establish time and again, hey, I will help you. I am with you. Just do it my way. Trust me, believe me, and it will work out. Continues on here. The number 40 in the Bible appears to be connected to many of the same themes. The idea of wilderness, this journey, this path and this journey that we're on. These shared themes include periods of significant trial and testing. or sometimes punishment for rebelling against God. Some examples focus on the teaching and preparation of God's chosen leaders. I think that's an interesting point. This person is just writing these things, but as I read this, I start applying it to today. Number 40 shows how God is redeeming. I'm sorry. Some examples focus on the teaching and preparation of God's chosen leaders. And I'm just going to be upfront about it. Our leaders have done nothing but let us down. That's all they've done. As I go back to, and I'm just going to go back in time here, but as I recall, for instance, you can go back and you can find the 1995 College Envoy, and it will show you a whole picture of the Council of Elders at that time, or the Advisory Council. Men who were handpicked to be there, and they were to protect the truth at all costs. I'm not talking men who just went by stories passed down from generation to generation. I'm talking about men who were there, who saw it, who experienced it, who ate it, who drank it, and went through it on a day-to-day basis. I'm talking about those leaders. The number 40 shows how God is redeeming his people from the world. We're supposed to come out of her, my people. But for some reason, I see the overwhelming desire of brethren today. They want a foot in the world. They want a foot in the church. It can only work for so long, brethren. Two cannot walk together unless they be agreed. So if there's even just a 1% difference, just 1%, eventually it's gonna get too wide and you can't straddle it anymore. Bringing a time of restoration and renewal. 40, the number 40, a time of judgment and testing. The number 40, a time of judgment and testing. The number 40 in the Bible appears to symbolize accomplishment of God's purpose. There are many examples connected to the number 40 in the Bible. Notice this. The flood and Noah and the ark. It rained for 40 days, 40 nights. Moses was 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the desert before being called to lead Israel out of bondage. Moses was 40 days on Mount Sinai. Twice. Israel was delivered into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years, Judges 13. There were a few good leaders that we read of in the scriptures. King David, Solomon, they reigned for 40 years. How about the judges? Gideon, Othniel, Barak, Deborah, and Eli. All judges who judged for 40 years. Moses, Elijah, and Jesus all fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. Remember Jonah? He goes to Nineveh. How long was Nineveh given to repent? 40 days. Jesus was on earth after the resurrection. For how long before he ascends? 40 days. And so we see it over and over and over again throughout the scriptures. This number 40. 40, a time of testing, a time of judgment. Time of testing, a time of judgment. Now we'll go through that. I mean, why take the time and the exercise of going through these things? Well, I guess I would like to ask is any of this important to us? Does any of it pertain to us? Is there any duality for us? Any at all? Do you think, brethren, maybe we should consider, just maybe, how maybe, perhaps, how possibly we might put God to the test in our own lives? Or maybe a little bit bigger picture, how we have perhaps put God to the test as a church. I mean, after all, we are the Israel of God, as you read in I think it's Galatians 6:16. A church who now dwells in, I'm sad to say, the wilderness of abject spiritual confusion, division, and mutiny against the great God who has given us everything. I'm not talking about a wilderness full of cacti. We're talking about the spiritual wilderness of sin. I don't think it's uh, any surprise. You know, we can go back into the old literature and read all those articles that Mr. Armstrong wrote about the spiritual coming out of the spiritual wilderness of sin, over and over and over, which essentially later, as it was compiled, became known as what we call the book Mystery of the Ages. As I have listened to many messages over the years, I've noticed that, there's certain kinds of ministers. There's the ministers who completely avoid prophecy. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because they're just not good at it. It's beyond them. It's maybe over their heads. It's just not their forte, and so they avoid it completely. I've seen ministers like that, and then I've seen the other side where everything's prophetic, and this is a type, and that's a type, and this is a type of a type, and this is dual, and let's flip it, and that's back dual again, and let's turn it upside down, and it's more dual, and because it's a type of this type, and I've seen that too, and I don't want to. I don't think either extreme is good. I don't think either extreme is good. I think both are unhealthy, and I will even admit to myself that if I were to put myself on a pie chart and divide up my sermons on a pie chart, prophecy would not be my biggest section either. Now, I think we need some of it. To eat a healthy diet, you do want you want a couple different kinds of vegetables and maybe a different kind of meat, or a few different things to have a balanced, healthy diet. So I think it's important that there should be some Christian living, and there should be some doctrine, and there should be some prophecy and things, marriage and family, and there should be a good diet to even be spiritually healthy. Now, I don't think we should go to either extreme, though. But I would like to do something today that I don't typically do. It's a little bit out of character for me. And I'd like to speculate a little bit today. I'd like to speculate a little bit on the potential duality of this 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Let's speculate a little bit. My family, we heard a sermon, I don't know, maybe a month ago. Individual, his name was Dean Wilson, gave a sermon on government. And I'll just paraphrase at this point, but he talked about the importance of the government of God, and that is very important. And he showed specifically and scripturally how it's imperative that we stay within God's government. And as soon as we don't stay in God's government, he says, what happens is now you start getting splits and divisions, and then we end up like the churches of the world. You take Christianity, mainstream Christianity, you might have, my wife and I we were coming back on a trip just recently, and I forget how exactly the number, but we went by a number of, and I'm just going to use it as an example. I'm not picking on them for the sake of them, but we went by a whole bunch of Baptist churches. And we saw, I think there was a Southern Baptist, and we saw I think we saw everything but Northern. We didn't see a Northern Baptist. I think it's the only direction we didn't see. And then there were some other kinds of Baptists. Why are there all these divisions of Baptists? And the point of his sermon was, hey, if we don't stick to the government of God, that's what's going to happen. And he was absolutely correct in what he said in that sermon. And what he didn't understand, that sermon was, I guess you could say, a Christian living or maybe doctrinal sermon, but in effect, it ended up being a prophetic sermon because that's exactly what happened. What he said in that sermon is exactly what we have been facing now this whole time, right now, this very day. Now he didn't know. I don't think he knew it would be prophetic. But now as we look back, I'm saying, yeah, it was prophetic. It's exactly what happened. Now, I wish he would have done a follow-up sermon back then of okay, when it happens, this is what you do. Because it happened. And now a lot of us, we sit at home or we're off in all these little splinter groups all over because nobody knows what to do and nobody knows where to go. Nobody wants to trust each other. Nobody can work together. And it's sad as we dwell in this spiritual wilderness of confusion and division. And so I'm going to speculate. I'm not going to say this is prophecy. I don't know if it is. That's why I'm saying it's speculation. I think it could be prophetic, but I don't know. And because I don't know, I'm not going to come before you and say, this is the way it is, because I don't know. What I do know is that God is there. I know that, God's hasn't gone to sleep. I know Jesus Christ is still the head of the church. I know all these things happen for a reason. And so it leads me to speculate a little bit. Is there duality to Israel's 40 years of wilderness wandering because they tested God 10 times and God finally said, all right, you have tested me, you have despised me, you have rejected me despite everything I've done for you. And so now you're going to go wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That's what you're going to do now. Time will tell, I suppose, if this sermon has any validity to it. Time will tell. I don't know of any place. If someone else out there knows, I'm more than happy to look at it. But I don't know of a place where Mr. Armstrong taught that there was this duality between Israel's 40 years of wilderness wandering and what we have now faced today. I don't know that he taught. I don't know that Mr. Armstrong foresaw what the condition we're in now. I don't believe, and I could be wrong, but I don't believe that when he handed the reins over to Mr. DeKoch, that he knew in his mind, oh yeah, this guy's just gonna go way off base and change everything. I don't think he thought that. I don't think he knew it. So I do know we have to tread lightly. It's not my job to introduce new doctrines. I'm speculating. And truth be told, if I'm wrong in this speculation, we should know within a few years, I think. We should know. I think it'll come out. Mr. Armstrong died January 16th, 1986. January 16th, 1986. Today, let me look. Today is January 18th, 2025. January 18th, 2025. It's been 39 years since he died. It's 39 years now, brother, since Mr. Armstrong died. So we're within a year of what? 40-year anniversary. 40-year anniversary of his death. And what have we faced In the 39 years since that man died, since God's apostle died, what have we faced in 39 years? We've gone through apostasy. We have witnessed the great falling away. And we are living terrible, ungodly division in the church of God. That's what we have faced now for 39 years. Next year will be the 40th year, the 40th anniversary since his death. And as I consider, I hope you consider this journey we've been on through this spiritual confusion. I have pondered, and I've kind of meditated on it, and I've thought about it, and I've gone back and in as much detail as I can to determine, did we test God 10 times? Did we despise God 10 times? Have we rejected God 10 times? Where God finally said, you know what? Fine, I'm gonna give you your way now. And now you're gonna go wander for 40 years in the spiritual wilderness of confusion. That's what you're gonna do now. Because you tested me. You did now these 10 times. How do we pinpoint the 10 times? And how can we be certain which of the 10 would be the right 10? And so there's these questions, and I know there are, and that's why I'm saying I'm speculating, because I don't exactly know, but it's interesting to ponder, because brethren, there has to be a reason, and I know there's a reason, and I know there's a purpose, that for 39 years now, really nothing has happened. I don't see any great leader out there. I don't see any true man of God who has stayed completely faithful to the truths of God as was handed to us on a silver platter. I don't see anybody out there doing the true work of God, not anywhere near the sense of what was done through Mr. Armstrong. It wasn't Mr. Armstrong, it was God through Mr. Armstrong. Oh, there's things going on, but we can take every splinter group, even the big ones, the LCGs and the UCGs and the COGWAs and some of the other ones that are not quite as big. You take all of them, the PCGs and the RC, add them all together, and they don't even touch what was done through Mr. Armstrong. Don't even touch it. These last 39 years. So did we test God 10 times? And has God just said, all right, you're gonna go wander now. Just gonna go wander. We're gonna put this little doodad, we're gonna put this show on hold. Did we have our 10 times? If we did, when did it start? So we go back, and I go back and I start, okay, let's retrace the steps, and let's go through, and what changed, and what did it change, and how significant it was to change. Was it, when you go back to, what I coined the golden years, 79 through 86, the get back on the track years. Well, why did we have to get back on the track? Well, because we got off the track. That's why. Did it start back then already? Did it start in what was clearly the liberal 70s? The watering down and the liberalization of the doctrines, the intellectuals getting in there. And so for those 7 years, Mr. Armstrong had to combat it, and he was against it, and he fought it, and was working hard and diligent to get the church back on the track. Was that part of it? Did some of it occur back then? And then it culminated in the STP in 1979 or 78. Was that part of it? Or the 10 times after his death? Was it after he died? And does it then relate to okay, he restored the truth. He was an apostle of God, and he came in the power and spirit of Elijah, and he restored all things, restores the truth. So then, okay, then he dies. Does the 10 times relate to what we did after he died? Here it is. Here it is on a silver platter. Now, what did you do with it? What would include the 10 times? There's a number of things I can think about and I come up with, and it's not hard. There's lots of places you can search on the internet. It's not that difficult. And I guess until the internet shut down and we can't do it anymore, it's, the information's there. The truth is one click away. What was our 10 times? If there were 10 times, what was our 10 times? Well, I think about how they changed the healing doctrine, and I don't know if some of you remember, but they were changing that as early as 1987. Now, some aren't going to remember anything I'm going to say because you might not have been born yet, or you were just too young at that point. I was pretty young at that point. But they started changing the healing doctrine. 1987. Mr. Armstrong taught that, and he went through that truth. The STP, for instance, tried to water all that down, and he fought that. He combated it. What did we do with it after he died? Was that one of the 10 times? Was it when Mr. DeKoch declared himself an apostle? Was that one? Well, as we look back in history, it was Herman Hay who initially got up in one of his sermons and said, "Hey, Mr. Armstrong, he's not a prophet. He's an apostle." And that was the mid-50s that he said that. And Mr. Armstrong, he didn't like that he said that, but then a little bit later, it wasn't long in it was still in the mid-50s, he came back and said, "Yeah, he was right. I am an apostle." I've read the article. I know he said it. And then you virtually hear nothing said about it until you get to the 70s. And then he just hits it over and over and over that he was an apostle. So anybody out there that doesn't, well, I don't know if he was an apostle and we just don't know. No, he said he was an apostle time and time and time again. We are without excuse. He said he was an apostle. He said the fruits approved his apostleship. He's not a pope going against the scriptures. No, he taught the scriptures. And so we can, as Paul said, follow him because he followed Jesus Christ. Not in opposition to, not in a different direction of, but, as an apostle, he said, "Hey, the pillar of fire is over there. We got to go that way. Not this way. We got to go that way." Well, Mr. DeKoch came along, and if you recall, go back and look. Some of you won't recall. Mr. Armstrong handed over every single title except for one. He did not name Mr. DeKoch an apostle. He didn't do it. And I think within, within 8 months of being named the new leader, within 8 months, he declared himself an apostle. And the fruit showed something very different. Was that one of the 10 times that he would take that upon himself? Was it loosening up and getting loosey-goosey and allowing birthday celebrations? Was that something? Because that took place as early as 1989. 89. When that started. Now we have individuals today, and we don't want to keep birthdays. We just want to, but it's okay to acknowledge them. Oh, okay. Well, who defines acknowledge? Because Joe's acknowledge is way different than Janie's acknowledge. I'm seeing, and I know of ministers out there who, we don't want to keep birthdays, but it's okay to acknowledge, and then they show their pictures on Facebook of blowing out parties. And I don't know how many times and for some reason, it's usually the ministers' wives who are wishing everybody happy birthday. I don't know why that is, but it's what I see. Was that one of our 10 times? I don't know. I just show it as a possibility. 1990, they laxed up an interracial marriage. You go back to the Mystery of the Ages, there's no mixing that up. Like you you can't say maybe or I'm not sure. No, it's quite sure, it's quite certain, and it's quite clear. Yet they watered that down as early as 1990. They started changing about the born again doctrine. That was 1991. I was listening to a Bible study last evening from a minister. He's a friend of mine, and he had, part of it was question and answers. One of the questions came in, can we prove the 7,000 year plan of God? That doctrine started getting watered down in 1992. 1992. And the scriptures clearly reference it. We can clearly see the how it points to, and even the day for the year. And of course, with God, a day is like 1,000 years, and you got the 7 days of creation. And then in Hebrews 4, it talks about how the Sabbath is pointing to the millennium, that 7,000 year period. And we can go back to Josephus, and again, I'm not saying for doctrinal reasons, but for even just historical reading, even he shows that it was a doctrine of God's church. They knew it and taught it back then. How about 1993? You remember 1993? I do. I remember when the booklet came out, and I remember it distinctly. God is ... I remember the booklet. You know what else I remember? Vaguely, mind you, because it was a while ago. Hardly anything was said about that booklet. Barely a peep was said about that booklet. Now, if you were one of them out there and you read it and you spoke out about it, hey, great. A lot of people didn't. A lot of brethren didn't. And I thought, why? What? Because very clearly, it was the gate, if you will, the floodgate to the Trinity. And the Trinity doctrine does away with, smashes, completely makes null and void God's plan and purpose for mankind. Because the Trinity is a closed circle of the three, and it's closed. No one gets in, no one gets out. Completely against the gospel of the good news of the coming kingdom of God, and that we can be a part of the very family of God. It crushes the whole thing. Yet in 1993, God is ... the floodgate to the Trinity. Was that one of the 10 times that we tested God, that we rejected God, that we despised God and the wonderful truths that he gave us on a silver platter? Was it? Maybe. How about when they liberalized divorce and remarriage? And how about when they no longer taught the church eras? All this happened through the apostasy. Every bit of this happened. They started allowing voting. The spirit and man doctrine was essentially killed. Grace by faith alone. All those things began to change back then. Or how about this one? When they started changing the Sabbath, saying it was no longer a sign between us and God. As a matter of fact, it went even further. I remember I was there. Now you can even work on the Sabbath. After all, would God really expect you to lose your job over the Sabbath? Of course, ministers never had a problem with that. The ministers never had to be faced with that, did they? And so they'd get up there and preach these sermons about, you just got to trust God, and if God will get you a new job. But then when it came time to standing up for the truth, where were those ministers? Where were they? Did we test God? Did we despise? Did we reject what we were given? Oh, I mean, what's wrong with playing a little golf? It's relaxing. It's good Sabbath activity. That was December 1994. I remember it. I was there. I heard the sermon live. I was sitting, I wasn't in the auditorium. I was in one of the, I think I was in Jackson Hall, because he gave that sermon in Big Sandy, Texas, where he gave that sermon. It's 3 hours. 3 hours. Was it when they accredited Ambassador College? I keep referring to myself. I'm not trying to be an egomaniac here. I'm just saying I remember these things. I have an associate degree from Ambassador College. I have a bachelor degree from Ambassador University, because it was accredited. And when they accredited it, I think it was 94, maybe later 93, 94, I think somewhere in there, they accredited it. And when it became accredited, they changed it to university. Mr. Armstrong was vehemently against the accreditation of Ambassador College. Vehemently opposed to it. He knew it was wrong. He knew it was not the way to go, and he refused to do it, despite the fact that there were many administrators and ministers who were trying to push him into it. And he said no. And I remember, brethren, I was just flabbergasted when I was in LCG at the time, and I was flabbergasted when they brought a man in for the sole purpose of accrediting their little college that they had. And I remember that man. Now they brought him in. Oh, he's not going to give a bunch of sermons right away, and he's just going to help us. And well, that didn't last long. And I remember that man saying, "Oh, Mr. Armstrong, he just didn't understand. You know, he just didn't get that what accreditation meant. He just didn't get it." I remember him saying it. I'm not trying to defame anybody, but I remember it. I heard it. And he was one of the ones back in Worldwide that Mr. Armstrong had to fight against. And then I remember, now here he was in this group. I thought, oh, okay. I graduated from Ambassador College in 1995. 1997, those doors were closed. 1997, the doors were closed. For good. So I guess that senile old man that they all talk about, maybe he kind of knew what he was talking about. Just maybe. Just maybe. But did we despise it? Did we reject it? Did we test it? I don't know. Maybe. Remember, this is speculation. I don't know if these were inclusive of the 10 times, or I don't even know if we really did have 10 times. I just say, well, is there duality to it? Is there any duality here? And so we speculate. I'm speculating, and I think maybe we did. What I do know is that we had an entire generation of leaders. I'm talking Advisory Council of Elders. I'm talking long-standing evangelists, which is the next office below the apostle. I'm talking about pastors. I'm talking about elders who were directly taught by Mr. Armstrong. They were there. It wasn't hearsay. They were taught by the man. Some of them traveled with the man. Some of them had dinners with him. breakfast is lunch. They were there. It wasn't hearsay. It wasn't a distant story that they heard from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone, because we know that when you get stories that were heard from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone, that sometimes details get a little well, what's the word, discombobulated, something this might get dropped and this gets changed a little. And no, that's not the case, brethren. They were there. They were there. They learned from him in person. They learned from him in person. And with their lips, they professed to believe it. And in turn, they taught it to the brethren. But then what did they do with it? As soon as he dies, what did they do? And one by one, for the last 39 years, we have commenced to dissect and to tear down every one of those truths. Which tells me they never really believed it in the first place. It was just lip service. That's what that tells me. It tells me that very potentially it was nothing but testing God. That's all it was. Rejecting and despising God. Now, some of you out there, if you're probably about 40 years or younger, a lot of this is probably completely brand new to you. Probably completely brand new. Quite potentially you've not heard any of this. Some of you out there, you're sitting in church because this is what mom and dad do, and you weren't there. You have no idea what I'm talking about, and why we are where we are today. You just know we are. But you can go back and study these things. There's nothing I'm saying that you cannot go back and prove. And you can find it if you'll take the time to do so. To my knowledge, there's not one single solitary leader who came from that time frame and that generation of men who were there and who saw it and who and personally lived it. I don't know of one of them that has stayed with the truth. Every one of them, to my knowledge, has faltered. Every one of them. Now, if there's one out there and I don't know who he is, well, let me know. Let me know, because our family, we just want to follow the truth. To my knowledge, not one of them has held to the whole truth. Oh, there's the 90%ers out there. I know that. There's plenty of 90%ers. I mean, the whole truth. Despite the God-given opportunities that a lot of those men experienced. Now, is there duality? That's my speculation. Is there duality? Could it be that God is saying to them, as he did back then in Numbers 14, how long are you going to test me? How long will you reject me? How long will you despise me? How long? And therefore, could it be that whatever exciting plans that God has in store for the next remaining years, whatever they are, and I don't know, there could be great things coming. Maybe there are. That's up to God. There could be great things. There could be tremendous, wonderful events coming our way in the near future. Maybe, but whatever it is, and for whatever God has planned and in store for what I think is going to be the near future, could it be that whatever it is, that it's going to be left to the next generation? Because God said those that were 20 years and older, says, you're not going in. I'm going to leave it to the next generation. Maybe. There's, I'm sure, scattered brethren all over this world that are 100% faithful to the truths of God. Might be some ministers out there that are just 100% truthful and steadfast to what we've been taught. And it could be that second generation or the third generations or your fourth generations out there might be left to you. Might be left to you. We're still in the Philadelphian era. Well, by the way, that was one of the doctrines Mr. Armstrong taught, another one that's been rejected. We're still in the Philadelphian era, and we will be until the Philadelphians are taken to a place of safety. Now, if that's happened already, and I haven't been informed of it, then I guess I missed the boat. But I don't think it's happened yet. And so we're still in the Philadelphian era, which then tells me, well, to that era, God said there's a door. It's an open door, and no one can shut it. Only God. That door's still there. It must still be open, or at least possible. Therefore, there could be some great big exciting things yet. There could be, until God says, now the door's closed. But who will God work with? It's going to be the younger brethren, maybe younger ministers who have shown themselves faithful. Throughout this delay of the last 39 years, next year will be 40. 40 years now. January 2026, we're less than a year out. If it was the death of Mr. Armstrong, if that's the starting point, the next year is 40 years. But I'm speculating, is that when the countdown would have started? It seems to be the most plausible thing to me, and that's why I'm using that as the date. That seems to me to be what be the most logical explanation of when it would have started. Would be his death, but maybe it was before, maybe it was a little bit after. I don't know. But whether it was a little bit before or a little bit after, or whether it was his death, if there is anything to this speculation, if there is the chance of duality, then we're coming up on the 40 years. Coming up on it. And if somebody was 20 years old in 1986, then what? You're about 60 now, isn't it? Because 20 and 39 would be 59 years old, right? So I think I'm doing the math right, because we're going on 40 years. So if you were 20 years old in 1986, you're pushing 60. If you were 30 years old, you're pushing 70. If you were 40 years old, you're pushing 80. God said 20 and above, you're not crossing the line. You're not going to that promised land. So God said, is there duality to that? Is there duality to it? Will those in that entire age bracket who were there and who saw it and should have known better, are they going to be excluded from whatever God has in store in the near future? And I would think so. I would say it's probably looking that way. Now, I'm not condemning anybody. I'm not putting a death sentence on anybody. It's not my job. But if there's duality to this story, then they won't be a part of it. It's just that simple. The story of Israel's journey throughout, through the wilderness, to the promised land. It's this narrative of what literally should have been an 11-day journey that ended up taking 40 years. It wasn't that far. It was an 11-day journey that ended up, because of circumstances on to their fault, that ended up taking 40 years to complete. And God purposely made them wander in the wilderness. Why? Why? Because during their 40 years in the wilderness, the Israelites frequently complained against God, rebelled against God, and rebelled against God's leader, which, brethren, is the same thing as rebelling against God himself. Get that straight, please. Get that point deeply seated in your mind, because that's what the scriptures bear out. When you despise God's appointed leader, you despise God himself. In their case, it was Moses. It was Moses. Now, I'm just going to ask, is there any spiritual significance of today in that we have despised God's leader, Mr. Armstrong? Any duality. Any duality to it. And because of our despising, because of our testing, and because of our rebellion against God's leader and against the truths of God's leader, has our journey been prolonged. Now going on 39 years. Next year will be 40. All I can ask is to ponder it, think about it, consider it. Because this is going on for a reason. This is happening for a reason. I want to read a coworker letter. I'm just going to read some paragraphs from it. This one is a coworker letter from June 25th, 1985. Same year, but or later in the year. June 25th, 1985. Mr. Armstrong writes, "Where are we right now in this significance of events?" And he's referencing that Jesus said to watch and pray about world events. And then he asks, where are we now in the sequence of these events? "We are comparatively near the second coming of Jesus Christ, near the end of this civilization as we know it, near to the peaceful world tomorrow. We are now, and have been for some years, at the point of Matthew 24:14, where Jesus said, quote, 'And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end of this world come.'" Now that was technically accomplished in 1972, when we had reached every nation in the world. He continues, "That gospel was not preached to the world after AD 70. For the first time after that, it began going to the world by this church and work in 1953. During this time, nuclear weapons of mass destruction have been produced that can blast every human life out of existence. Then, what next?" Verse 21 of Matthew 24, "A time of violence and great destruction as never before or after, and except God intervenes to cut it short, not a single human being will be left alive, but for the elect's sake," and thank you to whoever the elect are, we thank you. He says, meaning you and me, "God will intervene supernaturally and cut it short." Verse 22, "Then what? Immediately," verse 29, "there will be supernatural frightening signs in the sky above, and then those left alive shall see Jesus Christ coming in supreme power and glory to take over the throne of the earth and rule." Right now, it seems, God has been holding up events. It seems God has been holding events in the world back. It's 1985. We had expected the Great Tribulation to come before now. Why the delay? Why the delay? it surely seems God has held the winds of terrorism and the Great Tribulation back to allow time for the fulfillment of verse 14 in a more complete way. Already we have reached every nation on earth with the gospel of the kingdom. That was 72. But not intensively enough, apparently. Not intensively enough, apparently. Another thing, we are in the time of final exams in God's church, and perhaps we are not yet sufficiently tried and tested and proven to be ready to sit with Christ on the earth's throne. Perhaps we ourselves, all caps, have been holding up the march of events. What an impactful statement. What an impactful statement, brother. And here we are. Well, that was 85. We're 40 years after that statement. What did we do with it? What have we done with the truths of God? And are we ready to sit with Jesus Christ on his throne? Are we ready? All I can ask is that you'll answer that question with honesty. God did not take Israel's rebellion lightly. Their complaints were a direct affront against God's truth. And as a result, God responded and he gave direct punishment. Again, I'm not here to condemn, okay? And I hope everyone understands that. That's not my job. I can't condemn anybody. You know, God is our judge. Not Michael Ellerson. God is our judge, but at the very least, I would hope that it will give each and every one of us deep pause about ourselves and about God's church today. I hope it would do that. There's at least three major reasons for their 40-year delay. Their lack of faith, their disobedience, and their idolatry. Overall, the 40 years typed God's judgment in Israel. And, you know, it took that long. It took that long for an old, faithful, rebellious generation to completely die off. God said, you're going to tap out. You're not going into the promised land. So God said. But in the end, it was because of their lack of faith, their lack of trust, and their disobedience against God that God altered literally an 11-day journey into an epic 40-year saga. 40 years. So at the very least, I would hope that story is a warning for all of us who are claiming the truth. Because I don't want to, and I want my family to, and I don't want any of the brethren to forfeit your incredible human potential. First Corinthians chapter 10, well-known scripture, 1 Corinthians 10, where it says here, all these things happen. Why did they happen? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, all these things happened to them as examples. They were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. The Israelites were punished for 40 years in the wilderness because God is a just God. And he's a just judge. And he will discipline disobedience. And rightly so, brother. He will discipline those who disobey his word. He gave that nation a task to enter the promised land, and they refused. They refused it. And so, what we learn is that God desires obedience. And so their failure to follow his will and his way, it incurred discipline. No, the discipline still meant to help. It meant to help to mold his righteousness. those 40 years served as a time for Israel to learn to trust God, and it was an act of mercy. God sustained them the whole time. I mean, he still performed how many miracles? Their clothes didn't wear out, and their shoes didn't wear out, and every mom out there is like, man, I wish I had that. Especially the prices of things these days. They had manna, they had water, yet they keep grumbling, complaining, and doubting, and so the generation that left Egypt, their hearts were hardened. They had hardened hearts and stubborn hearts, and they needed to be cleansed of that. God works patiently. I mean, you remember, one day to God's like 1,000 years. Notice Hebrews 3. Hebrews 3, verse 8. Hebrews 3, verse 8. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, in the day of trial, in the wilderness. Do not harden your hearts as they did in their rebellion. The 40 years portray the potency of consequences for decisions made. Galatians 6:7, we reap what we sow. So, prophetic or not, because remember, I said it from the beginning, I'm speculating. I understand this is speculation. I don't know if this could be prophecy. But whether it is or not, the episode remains a sober historical fact. It's an example against distrust, against complaining, and against mutiny towards God, and all of which we have faced today. It stands for that. Numbers 14, again, if you would. Numbers 14. Numbers chapter 14. And I'll read again here. Verse 11. Numbers 14:11. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people reject me? How long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? How long are they going to treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe me? May we answer faithfully today? In the Israelites' lengthy journey to the promised land, it serves as a sobering reminder that God, I hope it does, that God will not tolerate compromise. He's not going to tolerate it. He will not tolerate sin. He will not tolerate a lack of faith. He didn't do it then, and he's not going to do it today. Not with a people who have an incredible human potential. Not with a people who are supposed to be learning to grow in the character of God, that we may sit and help Jesus Christ in his kingdom, to help all the other people in the millennium and the great white judgment and beyond. So the number 40 holds significant meaning in the Bible. It appears in several key stories symbolizing testing and trial. And my speculation is that maybe there's duality in the story. As I look back over these last 39 years, now it's almost going to be 40, maybe there's duality in the story for us today. And while the 40-year delay was certainly difficult for the Israelites, humanly speaking, 40 years is a long time. Humanly speaking, but it ultimately accomplished God's purpose in preparing them to inherit the promised land, at least the next generation to enter the promised land. So it's been 39 years since Mr. Armstrong died. 39 years. This year. I submit that when you embark on a journey of 40, you enter a period of trial, you enter a period of testing, but also of potential spiritual growth. And it's a time meant to test our faith, to push us to delve deeper into what we truly believe and our resolve to keep them. It's time to prepare ourselves for what lies ahead and to reflect on our choices, to reflect on our choices. And if the choices were bad, brethren, we can still repent. We can still change. We can still turn around and go the other way in our minds, in our hearts, in our actions. And to seek God's will and to seek God's character. It's time to prepare ourselves for the next phase of life. And what's the next phase of life? Final scripture, Revelation 19. Again, I know we know these verses. I just think it's still good to go read them. Revelation 19. And verses 7 and 8, let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. And his wife has made herself ready. You think we're ready right now? I mean, really? And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Not the unrighteous, but the righteous acts of the saints. The 11-day journey that took 40 years. Is it speculation? Is it prophecy? I don't know. But I can tell you this. Time will tell us. Time will tell us. I can't tell you. But time can. And if it's right, we're getting real close then. Next year is the 40th year. At least from Mr. Armstrong's death. If that's the date to use. But give or take, 40's coming up. So for those of you remaining, the next generations, I'm a second generation, so then there's thirds, and I know there's fourths already. I don't think the old generation. I think they're done. I just do. Those that were there, those that saw it and heard it in person and that should have known better. I don't think God's going to use them. Not anymore, I don't. It's going to be the next generation. And for you do well to learn from this biblical account. You do well to learn from our leaders who have failed us and to not repeat their mistakes. And embrace a posture. Be transformed. And into what? Not a path of disbelief, but an absolute wholehearted trust and obedience towards God.